Some people walk into storms and call it bravery. You moved before the clouds even gathered. There's a difference between instinct and illusion, and you've learned to trust the former, even when the world mocked your silence. While they stood wide-eyed in disbelief, scrambling to make sense of the crash, you had already stepped back from the edge long ago. Not because you feared the fall, but because you felt the structure buckling beneath the surface. Not from prophecies or panic, but from something older, deeper, awareness honed by scars. They mistook your clarity for cynicism, your detachment for arrogance. But you weren't distant. You were deliberate. They fell for the surface gloss. You watched for what flickered beneath it. You weren't fooled by polished speeches or confident smiles. You caught the tension in their breathing, the inconsistency in their timing, the slight shifts in energy when certain names were mentioned. While they chased applause, you tracked the tremors. That wasn't fear, that was focus. And as it all unraveled, you didn't flinch. Because deep down, you already understood. When everyone's celebrating how loud the music is, only a few notice the floor's about to give. Truth-tellers don't just shift conversations, they shift realities. And when reality feels too unfamiliar, people defend the illusion. That's what you've walked through, the high cost of clarity in a world addicted to comfort. You didn't create tension, you uncovered it. The unease wasn't yours, it was theirs, rattling beneath their well-rehearsed routines. When your truth cut through the static, it wasn't welcomed. It was labeled disruptive. Not because it was false, but because it arrived before they were ready to hear it without crumbling. What came next wasn't curiosity, it was resistance. Disguised as humor, wrapped in passive tones, sharpened with backhanded words. They didn't question your message, they questioned your presence. Not because you were wrong, but because you were inconvenient. You exposed what they were still trying to bury. And so you carried the weight of foresight alone. While others clung to yesterday's echoes, you stood in a clarity they hadn't earned yet. You weren't arrogant. You weren't intense. You were simply tuned in, and that's a frequency most can't survive at first contact. When you stand where few dare to look, don't be surprised when you're called the problem. It's easier than admitting they've been blind. Being right isn't always a relief. Sometimes it's a prison. Not because of the truth itself, but because of what it costs to carry it. It doesn't come with validation. It comes with resistance. There's no parade for the one who sees through the illusion too early. There's only the sting of knowing, and the ache of watching others beg for comfort over clarity. It's never been about proving anyone wrong. That was never the point. It was about honoring that inner pulse that told you something wasn't adding up, long before the cracks showed. While others were decorating the walls, you were feeling the tremors through the floor. Not out of pessimism, but out of precision. Out of a quiet refusal to be hypnotized by false peace. Clarity didn't hand you a trophy, it handed you solitude. Because once you saw the shift in tone, the subtle switch in intent, the hollowness beneath the gestures, you knew you couldn't keep showing up the same way. What once felt magnetic began to feel mechanical. What once made your soul breathe started tightening around your chest like a room with shrinking walls. You weren't withdrawing from them, you were returning to you. And when the mask finally slipped, you didn't gasp. You had already said your silent goodbye. They thought your stillness was surrender. They didn't know it was the sound of you locking your truth in a vault they'd never touch again. When the light dimmed, they called it your absence. But really, it was your protection. Because when your words start getting twisted, sometimes the greatest act of power is to speak none at all. Real ones don't beg for acceptance. They don't chase applause. They build in silence, endure in truth, and wait for the ones who see through the noise to find them. That's the energy you've been carrying. Quiet strength. Unshakable clarity. And now, It's starting to attract exactly who was meant to rise with you. There came a turning point, not loud, not dramatic, where the need to explain yourself simply evaporated. It wasn't your job to wake people up before their eyes could handle the light. Your role was to keep building, not because they believed in you, but because you did. You weren't seeking confirmation. You were sharpening discernment. Every person who dismissed your insight was, unknowingly, stepping out of the future you were preparing to protect. While others clung to stage performances and choreographed approval, you were drawn to those who didn't need matching outfits to prove loyalty. You found strength in those who stood firm even when it cost them something. Not the ones who waved flags when it was trendy, but the ones who stayed when the silence got heavy. This new connection wasn't about agreement. It was about alignment. About sharing a frequency that doesn't require translation. Along the way, a new clarity emerged. What once felt like community began to peel back. Beneath the surface of shared smiles and borrowed words, you noticed the shift. Intentions blurred. Relationships that once felt rooted started swaying with the wind. You weren't bitter. You were observant. You watched as loyalty was auctioned off to the highest bidder, rebranded as growth but reeking of convenience. You knew calling it out would turn you into a threat, so you didn't. You chose silence over spectacle. You let their movements speak for themselves. Because real vision doesn't argue, it prepares. It recognizes that not all connections are meant to go the distance. Some were only meant to show you what doesn't belong where you're headed. And that, too, is a gift. When clarity arrives, it doesn't make things prettier. It makes them real. And sometimes, what you find under all the sparkle isn't darkness. It's just emptiness pretending to shine. But here's the truth. You're not alone in seeing it. And what you're building now isn't just a life. It's a reality check for a world that forgot what real feels like. There came a moment when the surface could no longer distract you. The smiles didn't reach the eyes, the words didn't match the weight behind them, and the applause felt like a script instead of sincerity. You weren't paranoid. You were perceptive. And what once looked like community began to feel more like a stage where everyone had rehearsed their lines, except you. As the layers peeled back, so did the illusion. What seemed like connection revealed itself as a marketplace in disguise, where value was calculated and loyalty was conditional. Conversations sounded more like slogans, gestures were performed for visibility, and every moment felt quietly transactional. There was no real listening, just scanning for leverage. Presence became a currency, and absence became exile. The most unsettling part wasn't being excluded. It was realizing inclusion had always come with fine print. The praise had strings. The alliances had expiry dates. You weren't rejected for being false. You were sidelined for refusing to pretend. They didn't want honesty. They wanted harmony that didn't threaten the performance. The day you chose to be genuine instead of accepted was the day they stopped seeing you. Not because you faded, but because you disrupted the act. And still, you didn't shrink. You didn't shout. You just saw. And that vision, that unflinching refusal to look away, it's what makes you dangerous to the illusion and priceless to the truth. You didn't walk into that space looking to be admired. You showed up because something in you believed in what was being built. You gave your light freely, thinking you were helping to ignite something sacred. But instead of being seen, you were extracted. Instead of being met, you were used. And that's the betrayal that cuts the deepest. When sincerity becomes a currency others trade without your permission. There was a time you spoke with open hands, offered your insights without hesitation, allowed your growth to be visible. Not for attention, but for shared understanding. You thought you were planting seeds. You thought the soil was fertile. But behind the curtain, your roots were being pulled and replanted elsewhere, credited to gardeners who never touched the earth. The sting wasn't just that the space was hollow, it was realizing your voice had been echoing through someone else's script. Not to empower, but to decorate. What you shared from the core got edited for branding. What you offered in trust became someone else's talking point. You weren't uplifted, you were harvested. And when it hit you, it wasn't just disappointment. It was grief. Grief for the time you thought you were building something real. Grief for the moments you mistook manipulation for mentorship. Grief for every connection that was conditional on how useful your truth was to their performance. And yet, through that ache, something unshakable formed, the realization that you don't owe your depth to shallow systems. So no, you're not bitter, you're awake. And now, your presence won't be handed out like a business card. It'll be reserved for spaces that don't just tolerate truth, but can hold it without needing to reshape it into something sellable. Because you're not here to be consumed. You're here to build what can't be bought. There comes a time when truth stops knocking and starts kicking down doors. And when it did, what once looked like guidance suddenly felt like a performance with no soul. You didn't stop believing in leadership. You stopped mistaking noise for direction. And that's the moment your discernment evolved into something unstoppable. It became clear that the ones holding the microphone weren't offering vision, they were chasing validation. Their presence wasn't rooted in purpose, but in the fear of losing spotlight. Every announcement was crafted not to serve, but to secure. Not to lead, but to dominate. And they weren't building bridges, they were reinforcing pedestals. You began to notice the patterns. How questioning was recast as rebellion, how the absence of blind agreement became a threat to their carefully curated image. Their language looped in hollow affirmations. Their mission shapeshifted depending on who was listening. They gathered only those who echoed back what they already believed, a chamber of mirrors built to flatter the ego, not challenge the structure. The more closely you watched, the more it unraveled. Their sense of urgency wasn't rooted in service, it was a tactic. Manufactured tension, engineered chaos. A cycle of problems that kept them centered as both the alarm and the remedy. They weren't guiding anyone out of the fire. They were keeping the flame just close enough to make people cling to their shadow. What they sold as connection was just manipulation in disguise. Emotional choreography. A theater of empathy, designed to make others feel seen while never truly being seen themselves. And in that realization, you stopped mistaking volume for value. Because real leadership doesn't demand applause, it creates space for others to rise. In a world that sells healing like a brand and packages awakening into talking points, your refusal to follow the script was never rebellion, it was remembrance. You were never meant to stay inside systems that shrink what's sacred. And now, after walking through illusions dressed as enlightenment, you're finally stepping into a freedom that doesn't need an audience to feel real. What felt like spiritual guidance was something else entirely, a polished system feeding on honest seekers. Those who craved depth were offered formulas. Those who sought truth were met with tactics. Instead of empowerment, they were taught loyalty. Not to their own growth, but to the gatekeepers who positioned themselves as necessary for transformation. The tools of manipulation didn't look like control, they looked like inspiration. But the shift happened quietly. The role you were handed didn't fit anymore. You were no longer willing to dilute your essence into something they could use. The moment you stopped bending to stay digestible, the structure started to fracture. You weren't playing the character anymore, and they couldn't rewrite the narrative around your silence. Your expansion made their performance unsustainable. Freedom didn't come with applause. It came with distance. And in that distance, a strange ache settled in, not just from what was lost, but from what was never truly there. You began to see how much of your belonging had been conditional, how much of your connection was based on your compliance. The dreams you once built together now felt like abandoned sets on a soundstage. But beneath the disorientation, something unexpected began to emerge. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, It feels sacred. A life without translation. A truth without reduction. You stopped measuring your worth in how well you played the role. You stopped softening your message just to be heard. And what grew in that space was a version of you that didn't need to be approved to be powerful. What you lived through wasn't failure. It wasn't exile. It was initiation. Each distortion you encountered helped you refine your own clarity. Every manipulation you endured redefined your relationship to power. And now that the noise has faded, you're no longer asking for a seat at their table, because you've started building your own. This isn't about proving a point. It never was. This is about living with eyes wide open in a world that's been told to keep them shut. You weren't seeking chaos or craving collapse. You just couldn't pretend that silence meant safety. And now, as the curtain falls, you're not surprised. You're prepared. This wasn't foresight. It was fluency. You weren't forecasting doom. You were interpreting the script. While others clung to surface rhythms, you paid attention to what wasn't being said, to the omissions, the contradictions, the careful reshaping of truth to fit a more palatable frame. You weren't the outlier. You were the mirror they avoided. You saw it coming not because you wanted to, but because the signs were impossible to ignore. It wasn't a matter of intuition alone. It was the buildup of unsustainable habits, dissonant behavior, and hollow affirmations layered on top of crumbling values. Collapse wasn't dramatic. It was mathematical. The system they protected was held together by appearances, not by structure, and you knew that eventually the center would fold in. There was no longing for apologies, no desperate grasp for explanation. What you craved was certainty that your reality hadn't been a distortion, that your instincts weren't faulty, that your withdrawal hadn't been an overreaction. And slowly, without needing to demand it, that confirmation began to appear. The unraveling spoke louder than anything they once said. You stopped chasing closure when you realized the story was over, not because they said it was, but because the silence in their actions made it undeniable. What was once called progress revealed itself as performance. What had been framed as leadership dissolved into fear of losing relevance. And now, without needing to lift a word in defense, the truth is writing itself into every collapse they swore would never happen. This path you've walked was never about spectacle. It was never about becoming someone's savior. It was about returning to your own center when the world tried to scatter you. And now, without even trying, your presence disrupts illusions. Not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. You've become the signal others didn't know they were waiting for. It's not about stepping onto a pedestal. That structure already failed you. You've seen what happens when people build thrones out of borrowed language and call it leadership. This time, your strength is quieter, more rooted. You don't need a spotlight to validate what you carry. Your impact radiates from how you live, not what you claim. You walk differently now, and those paying attention can feel it. What once felt like emotional overload has turned into a finely tuned instrument. You catch what others dismiss. You notice when something feels misaligned, even when it's beautifully packaged. That inner alert system, the one you were once told to silence, has become your compass. And you're using it to map out safer ground, not just for yourself, but for those still trying to untangle their own truth from the noise. Where others seek authority, you offer presence. Where they chase applause, you anchor in integrity. And that contrast is powerful. You're not here to preach or persuade. You're here to embody. To quietly remind others, through your choices, your discernment, your peace, that they're not wrong for wanting something real. That they don't have to contort themselves to be loved. That there is life on the other side of performance. This new chapter isn't about convincing anyone. It's about alignment. And in that alignment, your path becomes more than personal. It becomes a reference point. Not a blueprint to follow, but a confirmation that there is another way. One that doesn't require abandoning yourself to belong. One that doesn't demand silence in exchange for safety. You didn't arrive here to rescue anyone. You arrived to reflect back what's possible. And that, without force, without fanfare, changes everything. The ache you carried wasn't because you were weak. It was because you were awake too early in a room where silence was currency. But now the echo has caught up. What you once whispered to yourself in the dark is being spoken aloud by others who are just now arriving at what you saw from the beginning. You're not loud. You're clear. And that clarity has always been the catalyst. You never chased applause. You walked away from comfort when it cost your truth. While others stayed in roles that kept them digestible, you outgrew the narrative, not because of ego, but because your soul refused to shrink for their convenience. You didn't demand validation. You chose alignment. And that quiet decision made you sovereign in a system that rewards conformity. Now, standing in the stillness after the storm, you're not gloating. You're reflecting on the endurance it took to stay rooted when walking away would have been easier. The noise you outlasted wasn't just external, it was internal too. You chose your inner compass over external consensus, even when it meant isolation. And now, what looked like solitude reveals itself as sacred preparation. This isn't a victory lap. It's a new beginning. You're not here to repair what was hollow. You're here to birth what's honest. The sensitivity you once apologized for has become your navigational tool. The same insights that got you excluded are now becoming the map others need to escape what's crumbling. You didn't break, you clarified. You didn't rebel, you aligned. And that makes you irreplaceable in the age of awakening. What happens now doesn't require a new title. It requires a new presence. Yours. Because the world isn't starving for perfection. It's starving for something true. And that's what you carry. You weren't early for no reason. You were early because you were essential. So step into your next chapter not with a script, but with the unshakable awareness that everything you've endured was preparation for everything you're here to build. Not just for you, but for those still finding the courage to break the spell. You were never meant to fit. You were meant to reveal the places where others stopped questioning. The discomfort you stirred in old rooms wasn't because you were confrontational, but because your presence disrupted the choreography. You didn't follow the rhythm. You felt the falseness in it. And instead of dancing along, you stood still, and that stillness made the music sound different to everyone around you. Some walked away. Others got angry. But a few started to listen differently because of you. What they called rebellion was actually remembrance, a returning to yourself without filter, without permission, without compromise. And now that the dust has settled, what remains isn't bitterness, but capacity. You carry the kind of depth that can hold contradiction without collapsing. You've learned how to stay soft without being silent, how to stay grounded without hardening. That's not a lesson in survival. That's wisdom earned through fire. So as the world searches for what's next, for systems that can breathe, for communities that can heal, for voices that don't sell truth in fragments, you become the quiet answer. Not the loudest, not the most followed, but the most aligned. You're not here to be a reaction. You're here to be a reference point. One that reminds others they're not broken for feeling out of sync with the performance. They're just ready for something real. Something you've already begun living.